Welcome to the Gridwise Architecture Council's video on Bridging Back from the Future. This presentation was originally given in 2023 at the GWAC seminar and workshop as part of AHR Expo in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Ron Bernstein. I'm the current chair of the council. And just as background, the Gridwise Architecture Council was founded in 2004 and funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. In another video, we have a great introduction to the council and its mission and current objectives, so I encourage you to see that video. As part of GWAC's mission, we're looking forward into the future to see where we need to get to with the electric grid. And we're posing the questions of how do we get there, and really the big question is where is there? As we're designing this bridge and the architectures and systems and technologies and policies that need to get us to an end state, we need to make sure that we're meeting the objectives by setting a set of principles for where the future is going to be, and then making sure that we're designing architectures and the processes needed to get there. We don't want to build our bridge from two sides and not have them meet in the middle. So we first have to set our 25-year event horizon. So we're looking at creating a vision and working backwards from that event horizon. So some of the questions that come up is, what's the future of the North American power grid? What steps do we need to take to get there? What's achievable, believable, and acceptable? We may have a design on what we think we can get to, or we may have some very lofty ideas that just aren't achievable. What are the market conditions needed to get across the bridge? Meaning, what happens with the economies, what happens with market pricing, fair and equitable access, and the technologies that need to support that. And who are the target stakeholders for change? What's beyond that 25-year event horizon? Well, if we step beyond that to a 50-year or a 100-year, do we need to make some incremental changes now to eventually get us to that stage? Or do we have any insights that we could use for our 25-year event horizon on eventually where we might get to in 50 or 100 years? So examples of step changes over the last 100 years are listed here, and there's quite a few that have had major impacts on society, from technology, from advances in culture and civilization, from, some of my favorite ones are moving from the fax machine to email, from a plain old technology telephone system to cellular phones. That's a current one. Even the passenger rail system moving to airplanes has had a tremendous effect on the ability to move people from and goods from one place to another. So there's a lot of step changes over the last 100 years, and we're looking at where are we going to be with the electric grid. So some of the elements of change really have to focus on who and how we do that. We broke them down into four basic categories: the regulatory process, policies that create incentives and prime the market, the philosophy and programs. These are programs to help encourage awareness and change, and then the underlying technologies that will help improve the grid and how we interact with the grid. So these four buckets we'll talk about in some detail throughout the course of this presentation. So if we look at some benchmarks of where we've been over the last, anywhere from 10 to 50 years, I have three charts here that may highlight some of the changes that are happening in the market. So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about energy consumption. Where are we as our prime energy consumption sources? So the chart on the left sort of highlights where we've been up in, in the 2020 timeframe, where our renewable energy is only about 12% of the overall energy production in the US. And if we look at that renewable energy, of that 12%, 26% is wind, and only 11% is solar. When we look at some of the other factors there, we can certainly anticipate the wind and solar and maybe geothermal will have a greater percentage, but overall it's still a fairly small percentage compared to petroleum, natural gas, and with the diminishing of coal, we'll start seeing those increase. So we have to sort of keep that in mind as to where the sources are coming from. Now, if you look at the chart in the upper right, one interesting fact here is we look from 1950 through about 2000, maybe you call it 2010. The slope of the curve of the power consumption has risen dramatically. But then from 2010 to 2020, it's been basically flat, with a few bumps here and there, but it's been basically flat, and that's the total consumption of power. And then if we look at the change in the consumption of fossil gas versus coal, there's been quite a change from, say, 2005 to 2020, with a small increment in solar and a little bit more in wind. And if we look at nuclear from 2005 on, it's been relatively flat. Actually, probably from 1995 to 2000, it's been relatively flat. Same thing with hydro and other renewables. So the real change is in moving from coal to fossil gas. And then on the chart on the lower right here, we can see the number of projects from 2021 that were planned to produce energy in the US grid and the total amount of power in gigawatts, and looking at the relative change from years past, where the new projects are substantially in that total solar and wind projects, very little in nuclear, a little bit in batteries, and certainly some in natural gas. So you can see where the investments are going into more renewable energy. So if we look at our 25-year event horizon with some of these metrics in mind, we can see that we may have to put a stake in the ground and say, we'd like to see, and we anticipate having, maybe a 90% reduction in fossil fuel as the primary energy source. And there's a variety of other ones we have here relating to grid architecture, grid upgrades to focus on distributed energy resources, more transactive energy systems that are more common between not just the source and destination or the utility and the consumer, but maybe multi-party transactive energy systems where people are sharing information and being able to develop rate structures and source, supply, and consumption models that meet a more transactive process. Maybe we'll see some prototypes of, say, fusion-based energy sources, and then we'll start seeing a significant reduction in coal, and maybe even a diminishment completely in 25 years of coal. We'll see if we get there. And same thing with natural gas, a reduction in 50% of that from 2020 levels. And then we will probably see an increase in the grid load. So as we're starting to see more electrification of buildings and cities and transportation, we have to plan for and anticipate a substantial growth based upon what we're seeing as moving from fossil fuel to electrical energy supply. So it's, as I said, we need to put a stake in the ground. It needs to be at least 50% believable and achievable and acceptable to the market players, the industry, the suppliers, the grid operators. So we have to have something to put a stake in the ground. So as we look at that, we said, all right, if that's our 25-year event horizon, let's back that up a little bit and see where do we need to get to in 15 years. And so we said, all right, so some of these metrics might be a waypoint along the way. And think of that bridge, and the bridge is not just a two-posted bridge, but maybe it's a longer bridge that has wayposts along the way, and every maybe, a couple of 100 yards, there's a new waypost. So we put one in at 15 years, and we have these as our metrics. And then in 10 years, a little closer, we have another set of metrics here, and so on until we get to something manageable that we can plan for, in the nearer term. So as our view gets, tighter and tighter, if you see the forest on the far side, we're not looking all the way to the horizon. We see, oh, this is a forest, and we can get there. So we'll see some of these things. Whether this is true or not is still to be determined, but we have to put some sort of metrics in mind here to get there. And as we're looking at the forest, and we can see the path down our forest, in 5 years, we may see, some increases in personal EVs and commercial EVs. So we have to plan for that percentage increase in electrical charging capability. We'll see an increase in battery efficiency improvements and also in the costs of batteries. So the proliferation will be increased. We'll see incentives for energy management to reduce greenhouse gases, as well as increases in, as we said, electrification. And that can be in appliances as well, moving from household gas-based appliances to electric appliances. So there's already movement in that direction, which will have an effect on the total energy consumption for electricity, which mentioned earlier. We'll see greater increase in distributed energy resources, especially as batteries become cheaper and more prolific. We'll see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from utility generation based upon the requirements for greenhouse gas reduction plans and incentives. And we'll see an increase in utility green energy sources. As we saw from that other chart, more investment in those energy sources that meet these overall goals. So why are we discussing this? And again, this was presented originally at an AHR and ASHRAE event, and a little bit of background there. AHR is the, ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and AHR is the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Expo. So ASHRAE is a standards body and industry council for the industry, and AHR is a trade show event. So when we were presenting this, we were talking to primarily building controls people. So these are people who are designing and developing building automation systems, installing equipment in buildings, and as buildings are a huge factor in the grid, especially as we're moving to more electric-based appliances and equipment, buildings are going to be consuming more and more energy. So there's a strong desire in this sector to reduce that energy, optimize systems, and manage them better, and also be a partner and a player with the utilities and the grid operators and the distribution and generation and transmission folks, so that there's an interoperability between them. So that's why we were talking about this at the AHR Expo event. And from an interoperability standpoint, we do need to have a better visibility into how to share information, more than likely using some of the transactive energy principles that have been talked about within the GWAC Council over the last few years. So as we see this trajectory, we have to move from buildings that are what we call silos or stovepipe buildings that have little or no interoperability outside of limited control systems, moving to a smarter building which has a good control system, it has a communication structure, it has the ability to monitor down to the individual subsystem or even down to the individual equipment. And then moving towards the grid-aware buildings where we can interface to those buildings from outside services. So that might be the utility coming in with a transactive energy service that you might enroll in, or using something like an automated demand response application where the utility may give you an incentive to reduce your energy spend by taking control of your building that you sign up to and adjusting your set points, for example. And then there's more advanced interfaces, which we'll talk about, called the Energy Services Interface, or ESI, that allows for even deeper coordination between what goes on inside the building and how it interacts with the grid. So as we move from left to right here, we're becoming smarter, more interoperable, and more data availability. So this Energy Services Interface, or ESI, is something we'll be talking about, and one of our other presenters will be discussing this in detail. But I want to bring it up here as sort of that demarcation point between the building and the grid services. So think of this ESI as a broker or a manager or an set of applications that can manage these internal building and external grid interfaces and applications to provide things like optimization routines and energy management, and as I said, demand side management or demand response applications. So it's a way to define the context and the information as they're exchanged in between the various sources. So when we talk about smart buildings, there are a lot of systems and applications inside a building that could potentially benefit from an interface into the power grid. And we call these transactive energy hubs, using an energy services interface between applications. In the IT world, this is sort of, think of it as a web services model of information that can pass from a building management system and a subsystem like the lighting subsystem to adjust lighting levels, lighting schedules, or in an HVAC system, it would be temperature and fan speed and other things of that nature. And being able to use that as a benchmark to help reduce energy and also provide feedback to the grid that shows what the actual load is for not only one building, but a whole portfolio of buildings that are normalized across an owner or a region, that helps the grid operator understand better how to manage the building loads as market conditions and transmission, distribution, and generation changes. So that's the end of my section, but I do want to introduce our speakers. We have 6 speakers that are going to continue on in separate videos, and we encourage you to listen to them in order. And we have all of these council members and administrators and friends of the council are going to be talking about various sections as it relates to their area of interest. So Ron Ambrosio is a consultant. He's a past GWAC chair. Ron Melton, who is our GWAC administrator from PNNL, and a scientist with PNNL working on grid and grid interaction and grid architecture. Ron Cunningham from American Electric Power, who's spearheading some of our work with grid architecture. And Leonard Tillman is an attorney working on regulatory issues related to the grid for his clients. Kay Aiken is with Dynamic Grid, working on municipal municipal power systems. And Jamie Colton from PNNL is our administrator to be in training, doing a lot of work in the system integration and building to grid world and energy services interface. So these are our panel members, and I hope you stick around and listen to their talks, and we thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Ron Ambrosio. I'll be taking you through in a little more detail what we mean by back from the future. This is a depiction of the electricity system that we were all literally born into, where you have traditional large-scale generation connected to transmission systems, and then step down through substations to local distribution grids, and finally across meter boundaries to end consumption. Like the fish takes the water for granted, most people tend to take the electricity system for granted. As a thought experiment, imagine zooming out to consider the whole system implications of deep decarbonization, in particular, how future power systems will function end-to-end as deeply interdependent and adaptive systems. A high-level view of a high DER grid with emerging trends. On the top of this slide, we have the traditional system that I shared a moment ago, and where we're transitioning is the lower portion of this slide. Multi-directional power flows, increased variability and volatility, significant supply in distribution systems, retirement of carbon-fueled large inertial mass generation, energy storage systems, transportation electrification, and smart buildings and homes with load flexibility. This involves a transition from hundreds to tens of millions of participating resources, a growing proportion of which will be privately owned. Many customers are empowered to have greater agency in how they interact with the power system. And for other customers, affordability and equity issues are growing. The demand side is playing an expanding role, and a diversity of new energy efficiency and DER solutions are needed to make participation accessible to all. And significant supply side investment is required, but whole system optimization requires much greater attention to moderate costs and to support equity. The objectives for future distribution grids are highly automated for enhanced response dynamics and economic efficiency, situational awareness, help improve management and reliability, ease of integration, energy affordability and accessibility, DER participation enabled across all types of ownership, support for integrated T&D planning, scalability and adaptability, and the concept of failure is normal, resilience, where that concept is planned into how we design the systems so that we're able to react to failure. Keeping the lights on in a much more dynamic power system requires instantaneous balancing of supply and demand. We'll continue to have seasonal variability, temperatures, depending on what part of the globe you're on, will drive different loads during the day, depending on the season. If we take one example of a solar PV supply, this is at the University of Queensland Centre, which has a large solar panel array. And you can see from the morning through the mid-evening, the demand of the supply is increasing, but you're seeing drops here and there due to cloud cover for the most part. Over a number of years, in this graph from 2010 through 2015, we see the increasing impact of more solar PV during the day on the overall power system demand curve, where the most recent 2015 on this chart shows what's known quite widely today as the duck curve, where demand on the power grid falls off drastically due to customer PV systems, and then ramps up rapidly as the PV system generation falls off in the early evening. Customer demand and variable generation must still be kept in balance every microsecond of the year as the dispatchable fossil fuel fired generation fleet is withdrawn. System architecture tools also empower stakeholders to better evaluate grid expansion proposals by applying structured future-back thinking and analysis. Here we're using the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge as a metaphor. On the right, we have the traditional deterministic, centralized, and fossil fuel grid that we're trying to plan forward on. And then on the left, this is where we want to get to, with a highly flexible, hybridized, and net zero power system. If we just use present forward design and planning, we run the risk of perhaps not quite meeting the other side of the bridge that we're trying to reach. That can introduce enormous cost if you're trying to shift the design and the objectives further down the road. So it's important that we think about where we want to be and step backwards to consider what choices do we need to make in moving forward from the right side in order to make sure that the two meet up as efficiently as possible at some point in the future. For example, how might our portfolio of billion-dollar projects be moderated for a future with whole system coordination that can significantly enhance operational efficiencies, which is really where we want to be in terms of reducing the operational cost of this very complex future system that we envision. The next section will go into grid architecture as part of the tool set that we're discussing.
Hi, I'm Ron Melton from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the Administrator Emeritus of the GridWise Architecture Council and a member of the PNNL Grid Architecture team. The previous presenters have done a nice job of discussing the drivers and trends moving us forward into electric power systems of the future. We've heard about the expected increasing complexity of DER-rich electric power systems and the importance of developing a vision of electric power systems of the future so that we can work back from the future to the present as we make decisions on what to do next in moving to that future. I'm going to take a few minutes at this point to talk about grid architecture, our grid-focused systems engineering discipline that gives us tools and techniques for representing current and future electric power systems and their complexity. I'll give you some definitions first, then a glimpse at the dimensions of grid architecture, followed by a few visual examples. Let's start with the definition of system. When we talk about a system, we're talking about a set of parts and, as we see in the quote, the interactions between the parts. More formally, we generally refer to the parts as elements or components. In many of our grid architecture representations, we are dealing with abstract views of the system of interest, and as a result, we represent classes of components and entities. We treat them as black boxes with externally observable characteristics, inputs, and outputs. For example, storage may be a component class. Treating storage as a black box, we don't care about what technology is used, but we do care about the attributes of storage, such as capacity, state of charge, and other storage-related characteristics. We may also have organizations or populations that are represented as entities, for example, distribution utilities, consumers, etc. System structure is defined when we define the interactions or connections between the components and entities. As we consider the interactions, the functional nature of the system emerges. Note that in complex systems, the emergent behaviors of the system may surprise us, as the collective behavior may go beyond what we expect from thinking only about the input-output of each component or entity. Interestingly, emergency shares the same linguistic root as emergent. We need to have tools that allow us to consider which emergent characteristics are useful and which are a problem, so as to avoid unintended emergencies as we blend new and old. Having defined system, we now have a context for grid architecture. As mentioned on the previous slide, architectural representations are abstract and consist of black box components, structure, and externally visible characteristics. We get this view from the system architecture part of system engineering. We also know that electric power systems are a form of network as defined both in engineering and in mathematical disciplines such as graph theory. We also know that an important element of operating electric power systems is the control of the devices in the system to achieve power balance, regulate frequency, and so forth. So control engineering is also important. We combine elements of these three areas, as shown on the slide, and apply them to the grid in the practice of grid architecture. Doing so enables us to reason about the grid's properties, behavior, and performance, and gives tools in the form of various graphical or analytical representations for helping understand and manage the complexity of electric power systems. Let's finish up definitions by taking a closer look at complexity. As we see here, complexity is related to the connections between what we are calling entities and components. The grid is a class of system called an ultra-large-scale system, as defined by the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. Several years ago, the U.S. National Academy of Engineering called the grid the most complex system ever built by mankind. Some have described the range of complex systems, with the refrigerator freezer being of medium complexity, the space shuttle of high complexity, and electric power systems being of ultra-large-scale complexity. The complexity of the system is further increased as we ask more and more of it by adding new components, new interactions, and new connections. It is also increased as we increase the complexity of the parts and pieces, and do this at expanding scales, as mentioned in the last part of this slide. Think about this example. We started with a system relying on physical inertia of spinning masses to help stabilize frequency. Over time, we've added a growing number of inverter-connected resources, now increasingly with a complex electronics device called a smart inverter, and we are now beginning to have less spinning mass in the system, a huge increase in complexity. To represent this complexity, and then be able to analyze and reason about the complex system, we need to represent the structure of the system. In grid architecture, we consider a network of highly interconnected structures, as shown on this slide. There are 7 of these structures, as shown on the right-hand side. Electric infrastructure is a representation of the physical electric power system, for example, circuit topology and related aspects such as the makeup of loads and supply. Digital superstructure is the parallel dimension of the information technology connectivity, computing, and data storage and analysis. Control structure looks at the various elements of system control for protection, synchronization, frequency regulation, voltage control, etc. Convergent networks looks at the structure and relationship to related infrastructures, for example, fuels, natural gas supply to gas turbine generators, or transportation, which may relate to electric vehicle charging. Note also that social networks may also have relationships. Regulatory structure relates to the governance of the system. And finally, industry structure relates to the business and operations of the structure. Keep in mind, after all, that electric power systems are fundamentally commodity creation and delivery systems, where the commodity is electrons. This set of 6 comprise the set of grid structures. A 7th structure we call coordination framework is the structure about how the 6 relate to one another, in particular where functionality is needed as a part of that set of interactions. As the inset box says, grid architecture is about structure, because structure determines what a complex system can and cannot do. This slide shows us various views of the powerful structural representations or tools we use in the practice of grid architecture, industry structure diagrams. Initially, we see structural representations of individual structures, in this case from back to front, operational control, market transactions, information and data exchange, and power flow. These are 4 of the 7 structures we talked about on the previous slide. Now we see them combined in a single representation of the 4 together, with different colored lines representing the interactions from each functional layer. If we add to the 4 functional layers the industry and regulatory relationships, we see an example with all structures represented, an industry structure diagram. As we consider how to represent the future vision, how to represent electric power systems of today, and how to bridge between the two, grid architecture gives us a powerful set of tools for considering our path to the future. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm Ron Cunningham and a member of GridWise Architecture Council, GWAC, with over 45 plus years working for investor-owned utilities. Before getting into the presentation, first a rhetorical question. When considering the future of the electric industry and its grids, do you prefer to just deal with the future expectations, needs, and challenges as they arrive? Or leverage some foresight of what the future expectations and needs are likely to be and start determining what no regrets actions to take to be ready for and prosper in that future? Spoiler alert. The next two slides focus on 9 anticipated future stakeholder relations and associated step changes across electric utilities, electric grids, end users, the customers, and their jurisdictions for consideration to be better prepared for what the future may be. Note, some of these relations and step changes are already being worked. This slide focuses primarily on electricity end users, customers, and their shift to becoming active grid participants or not. This and the next slide graphics contain illustrative electric industry and grid roadmap markers of what is ahead, i.e. future state stakeholder relations. These roadmap markers represent some of the statements about the future as extracted from GWAC's Electric Industry and Grid Stakeholders Visions and Future States Assessment Report to be released in 2023, including GWAC Insights. The markers also describe the future stakeholder relation, plus additional information not fully discussed in GWAC session at the 2023 AHR Expo, specifically more detail on necessary step changes, some requiring large leaps versus incremental steps from the current state to reach that electric industry and grid future state, and are biased to an USA perspective, though many apply to other nations. The first marker is regulations across U.S. jurisdictions. There are at least 5 of 7 hierarchical levels of regulations that are in play for any geolocation in USA associated with electric industry and the grid. The top level will be multinational, such as NERC, followed by national, such as FERC, EPA, FEMA, DOD, Congress, BLM, BOEM, and FCC. Below that would be regional, such as NERC regional entities, RTOs, ISOs, and future DSOs. Below that would be state or providence, for example, legislators, utility commissions. Under that, county, parish, or tribal governance. Under that, local and municipal governance. And finally, homeowner associations or multi-tenant building management governance. Step change, moving to a cohesive regulatory environment with regulatory boundary deference and non-conflicting roles and responsibilities as played out and constrained by jurisdictional boundary demographic, including electric energy, be that the locally available energy sources, load densities and the mix of those, geographic, weather, and ground usage, followed by energy costs to the end user, economic levels of the populace, politics, culture, will also drive need for governance to vary across jurisdiction that satisfy that geographic location stakeholder needs. Effectively, no one size fits all. The second marker is around customer flexible services. Customers' energy electricity expectations are met via sourcing options, access to advanced technology on their side of the meter, other energy and electric support consultation service offerings, and compensation for the end user's energy and electric service contribution to the electric grids, if grid connected. The step change, regulators, jurisdictions, and utilities moving away from the load following and customer just paying a monthly bill to customer demand side view and the customer's access to green, low to zero carbon sourced energy being enabled and appropriately compensated for grid-derived benefits of customers' DER microgrids, distributed generation, and their positive response to demand response events. The third marker is customer and aggregated DER energy and grid forming services. Purposely placed and participating advanced inverter DER in portions of the electric grids is most beneficial where their capabilities are needed versus simple aggregation of widely geographically located DER across multiple distribution and or transmission substation control areas of the grid. Utilizing advanced DER inverters, be those grid following or grid forming, can enable advantageous grid services. Per a Western Electricity Coordinating Council workshop on grid forming inverter-based resources, grid following DER inverters are defined as measure the grid voltage and frequency and then try to inject the correct real and reactive power to follow the voltage, including controlled current injection, with the following capabilities that are in common with grid forming inverters: closed loop voltage control, fast or primary frequency response, automatic generation control, dispatchability, and stability services. Grid forming DER inverters create a local voltage and frequency and then try to move that voltage to cause the correct real and reactive power to flow into the grid. With additional capabilities, controlled internal voltage phasor, voltage persistence and inertia, black start and island operation. These advanced DER inverters are expected, if not required, for larger commercial and industrial customer loads where the cost benefit is favorable and grid operator calling to be operated for specific DER inverter capabilities. Step changes include: first, regulators, grid engineers, and operators' acceptance of grid forming following inverter-based resource along with synchronous generator systems. Second, customers with larger energy and loads accepting a more active role in grid support with appropriate compensation of customers' grid connected and grid forming following inverter DER. The fourth roadmap is off-utility grid. This is applicable for premises owners where there is no grid available to disconnect from, or currently on the grid and has space for adding DER as allowed by local jurisdictions, or wanting to participate in a microgrid that satisfies owners' objectives, desires, such as economic viability of being off-grid, or not wanting to rely on the grid for any grid service, where the connection to the grid has been figuratively, if not literally, disconnected. Note, there still may be an expectation of the premises owner to use grid as backup. Step changes include: jurisdictions and regulations acknowledge premise owner rights to be disconnected from the grid. Second, if truly off-utility grid, premises owners have responsibility to provide their own backup if so inclined. Otherwise, regulators, jurisdictions, utilities must acknowledge the occasion temporary return of load from off-utility grid premises owners with an agreed service level and billing expectations for that backup from the grid service, if viable. This slide focuses on electric utilities staying relevant. The first roadmap marker is new utility services. Staying relevant in electric industry and ecosystem of electric grids requires creation of new services with sustainable value propositions, revenue streams, and the reduced reliance on revenue based solely on metered electric energy and demand. Dependent upon the utility type, be that investor-owned utility, public power, cooperatives, or municipals, and the jurisdictional regulatory restrictions in those areas. Examples of the new utility services includes leveraging the utility rights-of-way to grid customer premises for middle-mile telecommunication networks and powering of distributed network gear. Another is especially for distribution utilities, taking on neutral markets facilitator role, providing platforms for training flexible resources and innovative products and services, providing electrification options and business cases to customers, and energy and electric energy consumption, saving guidance, and other consultation to customers. The step changes: utility moving to different business models and service offerings and away from major reliance on metered electric demand and energy fees. Second is jurisdiction and regulatory authorizing and allowing compensation by the utilities for these services. Energy conservation and distributed generation is the second marker. Energy conservation and distributed generation is used in balancing future state electric energy and demand, organic growth, electrification, and other new loads. In the near to mid-term, also helps offset loss of carbon-based bulk generation and electrification ramp-ups in, for example, EVs and buildings decarbonization. Higher benefits to those distribution feeders with high levels of new electrification and jump steps in electric energy and demands is expected. Step changes include bulk generation with long transmission lines to loads, giving way to more distributed, smaller size, yet economically viable generation sources. Second, carbon-based to zero carbon-based loads is not a single jump step for all types of decarbonizing load types. It requires multiple separate steps and will be longer to materialize across the transition time epochs. The third marker is integrated resource planning with non-wire alternatives are an expected solution option for inclusion in integration resource planning submittals. The step change: jurisdictional and regulations and utilities acknowledging and accepting non-wires alternatives as viable components in the IRP submittals. Note: acceptance will be driven by the degree of DER and other non-wire alternatives that are in the jurisdictional area and maturity of the non-wire alternative solutions and ecosystem. The fourth marker is hybrid centralized and decentralized. This applies to generation of electricity, grid control and operation, and grid optimization across region, state, local, as applicable at the distribution, substation, and customer facility levels via hybrid solutions that enhance grid resiliency where low latency grid control applications and higher network latencies may exist, pushing those controls that can best be managed and responded to in time-critical periods to the edge of the grid, while resolving the local grid problems within the guardrails established by higher-level control systems, and reduce electrical transmission and distribution losses by moving generation of electricity closer to the loads. Step changes include regulatory and jurisdictional acceptance of the move from centralized bulk and transmission connected electricity generation to more distributed generation that is closer to load needs. Also, grid engineering and operations acknowledgement and acceptance of hybrid centralized distributed command and control schemes and solutions. And regulatory jurisdiction, grid engineering and operations acknowledgement and acceptance of hybrid centralized decentralized optimization across levels. Think layered decomposition. The last marker includes economic development efforts. Attracting business to set up new or relocate into different jurisdiction localities for shovel-ready industrial parks or brownfield redevelopments with business incentives that accommodate renewables will continue. The current and near midterm transition steps will build on streamlining bureaucratic and regulatory cross-jurisdictional regulations, zoning, taxing, and infrastructure improvements necessary to entice new businesses to consider the offered sites. Step changes include jurisdictions' willingness and capability to cooperate and collaborate with local grid service providers to pre-qualify target sites as shovel-ready with incentives, including collaborating with potential new businesses on what active participant role they aspire to in the grid. And second, local grid engineers and operators' capability and flexible grid service offerings to accommodate potential business needs and time schedules. In closing, this presentation's objective was to provide some foresight of what the future expectations, needs are likely to be, so that stakeholders can start determining, if not already working on, no regrets actions to take to be ready for and prosper in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Today we consider a look back from future regulations, to consider not only what the future may hold, but how we may best get from where we are now to that desired future. Today we consider a look back from future regulations, to consider not only what the future may hold, but how we may best get from where we are now to that desired future. Among other things that may need to be considered are multiple levels of regulators and regulations. Regulations that can incentivize investment. The supportive regulatory framework that may be needed to increase investment. The recognition that a patchwork or inconsistent framework of regulations can slow progress. Related, unexpected regulatory changes can not only delay but perhaps derail investment. Importantly, regulations should not pick winners, and regulations should not stop or restrict innovation. Instead, regulations and regulators should be looked at as providing a playing field that is fair, transparent, and supportive of the changes that we desire as a nation, and as even on the local level and state level, particular differences that may be preferred between different regulated areas and between different regulated frameworks. Importantly, this cannot be done without regulation. There's too much at stake. There's too much change afoot for it to be just the wild, wild west. But nevertheless, we see that there's an increasing focus on regulation as relates to long-term investments, investments that may take years to pay back. And the fact that investors may be dissuaded by an unfavorable regulatory framework. Even if the regulations are not the most desired, the fact that they are counted on as being relatively reliable and not constantly changing or shifting can be accommodated by investors. Of course, the regulations would need to support a model that will return desired results not only from an environmental standpoint, market standpoint, but also that support a reasonable return so that dollars will flow to this area. Importantly, regulations, while relatively steady, should not be so etched in concrete that desired and efficient changes would not be supported. In fact, regulations should incentivize changes that will be beneficial not only to the market, but to the environment and to the citizens and customers of the electric system. While we cannot expect every jurisdiction to support the same regulatory model, there should be enough consistency between states so as to support big investment by big players and still allow for smaller entrants a fair chance at advancing the future of the electrical system.
I'm Kagan, and buildings have a large role in the bridge to the future grid. I will discuss some of the foundational aspects of the distribution grid and the role of buildings and groups of buildings in building a strong structure for the future grid. And Jamie will follow with information on how buildings will interact with the next grid. One of the key aspects to decarbonization of our energy system is electrification of buildings and moving them from fossil fuel to electric-based space conditioning provided by renewables. Additionally, buildings are our first interface with the transportation system because most EV charging will take place at the building. This electrification of buildings, however, will create a distribution challenge. The National Renewable Energy Lab estimated that loads will increase on the grid by 81%, and distribution grid peak requirements will increase by 2 or 3 times. If we just expand our infrastructure to handle these loads, our utilization factors will actually decrease, making the grid more expensive. The bridge to the future is to develop more distributed resources, including solar and storage, that when managed well will decrease those peak loads and hence infrastructure expansion. This requires active demand response on the distribution grid, not just for peak hours, but for all hours, so we can shift, shed, and shape the load curve. Microgrids that can often disconnect from the grid can have an outsized role in this transition and can provide reliability and resilience benefits. As I described, the impacts on the distribution grid will be very large, but also very uneven. We have all heard of the duck curve that has been made famous in California, where solar power in the afternoon depresses net system load, then increases the power demand or ramping in the early evening. This will, however, happen on every distribution circuit in the country, but will be uneven, with some circuits having flatter system dynamics and enough capacity to handle them, and others being largely unable to handle them. This requires massive increases in distribution grid infrastructure. In California, Cavala, a consulting company, just did a study for the California Energy Commission that detailed California needs to spend $50 billion in distribution grid upgrades. And some have suggested that that number is up to $10 trillion for the entire U.S. These increased system dynamics and complexity require new functionality and an increase in the complexity of managing that system. There is, however, a bridge to the future to make sense of this all. The first step to minimizing our demand on our distribution infrastructure is described to this graphic, making our buildings more efficient so they use less energy, and then connecting them to the grid so they can respond to the grid's needs and not just the building needs. We then need to create varied types of distributed energy resources on that distribution grid. Lastly, we can use storage to level out the shape of the load curve even more. If we go in this order: efficiency, connecting buildings so they can provide demand response, and produce more power at the edge, then incorporate storage as needed, we can build a long-lasting and less costly grid of the future. The concept of creating buildings of the future where they connect to the grid is called Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings, or GEBs. The name explains the concept. Buildings of the future will be grid interactive and efficient. They will generate or store power locally, respond to grid conditions and signals, and receive value for the grid services they provide. These grid services being the ability to shift their load, shed load in emergencies and when possible, and the potential for things like smart inverters to shimmy or rapidly change their operations and provide support for frequency and voltage regulation on the electric grid. This will all shape the load curve so utilities do not have to build extra infrastructure that will only be used sporadically. While all buildings don't have to be microgrids in this concept, the ultimate grid-connected building are microgrids, Microgrids are a controllable system that can or not interact with the grid. Ideally, because of their smartness, they will interact with the grid and provide multiple services that a single building cannot. They can be a single building in their most simple form, a single customer like a university campus with multiple buildings, a distribution microgrid with multiple different customers, or an entire community in the form of a microgrid of microgrids. While the implementation of a microgrid is fairly complex, the idea is not. The elements of a microgrid include energy supply, often solar on rooftops, demand that can be connected and controlled, and energy storage to smooth the generation curve to better match the load. In the most advanced microgrids, there is something called advanced microgrid controllers that can manage storage resources, but also actively manage demand to shift, shed, and shape the load curve as needed to make the system more efficient. This idea of an advanced microgrid controller can be expanded to become a grid interactive microgrid, where not only does the microgrid support energy services for the customer, but is aware of grid conditions and can respond to those needs from the grid. This is how we will build the grid of the future. For buildings, the smart use of resources both behind the meter and in front of the meter can increase the value streams for buildings, making them more efficient and less costly to building owners. Building microgrids can receive value for support they contribute to the grid. This will overall improve the integration of renewable power in the building and on the grid, making the entire grid more efficient. This graphic from the Rocky Mountain Institute shows that renewable energy is 36% more valuable when coupled with grid building flexibility. That same building flexibility lowers peak load by 24% and decreases system-wide carbon emissions by 23%. These are all valuable benefits to society as we move down this energy transition.
My name is Jamie Colan with Pacific Northwest National Lab. Today, I'll be discussing a grid modernization lab consortium project that builds on the foundational interoperability work of the GridWise Architecture Council. In particular, I'll be discussing the energy service interface and facility-to-grid interactions. This body of work addresses the need for DER coordination at the scale of millions of units that will be deployed in the coming years to support decarbonization and electrification efforts. We describe a path for developing an energy service interface as an alternative to ad hoc custom engineered integrations of devices and systems. The goal is to reduce the soft costs associated with integration of DER, which are often deployed in a siloed manner based on technology type and region or jurisdiction. The approach described is service-oriented rather than direct control. This allows DER facility owners to choose how they participate, avoiding a mismatch between objectives. This approach is also technology agnostic, discussing operational objectives in terms of what is needed rather than what type of asset is providing the service, which also addresses direct control challenges associated with privacy. In order to cost-effectively address the challenges of scaling to millions of DER, the system must support a plug-and-play configuration. This includes self-identification, automatic discovery of the resources, and a service-oriented architecture discussed in the last slide. First, we need to be speaking the same language, describing the grid service and DER capabilities using the same terms. This will be helpful in defining the grid service agreements and the required interactions between the facilities and the grid. These terms should be applicable to any device or system type, so long as it's able to meet the performance requirements of the service. The terminology needs to be broadly applicable to accommodate the services used across jurisdictions and regions. We then will provide a guide for developing a specification in order to accelerate industry agreement and ESI standardization approaches, which will improve grid edge interoperability. On the right, you'll see some terms that are used to describe the objectives of grid operators. On the left, you see some of the objectives of DER owners, or in this context, the service provider objectives. And at the bottom, you'll see a slew of other terms used to describe objectives rather than services. By looking at the electrical and temporal attributes of these services, our team came up with these 6 common grid services. The GMLC team worked with NASB to develop standardized definitions for the services. The service definition includes the service name and a short description, a performance expectation, which includes the electrical attribute such as power, energy, and voltage, and an electrical location describes where the service is delivered. Timing describes the schedule and response time required to meet the performance expectation. We also included examples of additional information that are shown and will be based upon the service type. We provide context and background on why the service exists. And now some background on the Energy Service Interface. The concept has its origins with the GridWise Architecture Council when Dave Harden described it as a bidirectional logical interface that supports the secure communication of information between entities inside and entities outside of a customer boundary to facilitate various energy interactions between electrical loads, storage, and generation within the customer facilities and external entities. The only modification that has been made was to add the term service-oriented. The service-oriented approach uses the performance objectives from the Common Grid Services work to describe what is needed rather than how to provide it. This prevents a mismatch between the objectives of parties on both sides of the interface. By maintaining this boundary of privacy, DER owners have an option to coordinate all of the assets within their premise however they want, so long as they can meet the service objectives. To be scalable, however, the DER facility, which can be made up of one or many DER, will need to meet the plug-and-play requirements that we mentioned previously. During the course of the project, we came up with a set of fundamental principles to describe the concepts core to the ESI. First, the ESI is service-oriented. The interface is used to communicate what is needed, not how to deliver it. This includes the grid DER services that are described in terms of performance requirements, not device-specific functionalities. The architecture is really to facilitate machine-to-machine communications to provide those grid services. The ESI maintains privacy. Facility management function should not expose the identity or the details of individual DER, but rather the collective capability of all the DER in the DER facility for a particular grid service. These boundaries of responsibility on either side of the ESI are clear and protected by the style of the interface. The ESI is device agnostic. It's universally applicable to all types of DER if they qualify to address the agreed upon grid service. This avoids specialized interfaces based on DER technology type, and it streamlines the adaptation to new DER technology or advances in existing technology. Another tool we use to develop the ESI is the Interoperability Maturity Model. The IMM was developed with the support of the GridWise Architecture Council and describes these 6 categories of interoperability. There's another category related to community, which does not yet apply to the ESI, but you will find the details in the IMM documentation if you're interested. We use the criteria under these 6 categories, adapted specifically for the ESI, to determine whether the standard meets the interoperability requirements. Any gaps are identified and brought to the attention of the relevant standards board or alliance for their review. We assess the maturity in these 5 levels, as you can see below. In order to develop an ESI, we need to consider all the various interactions. It's worth noting that the interactions may not occur over one interface. For example, registration may occur via a web page, or performance might be measured by a separate meter rather than through the facility management function. However, all of these interactions will need to be covered to achieve interoperability. Here you see an example of some interactions that might occur over a reserve service. First, an asset would need to register and qualify to provide the service. Then, a service requester would want to schedule with the service provider, and that might include accepting that schedule. Once the schedule has been accepted, during the normal operation of a reserve service, a signal to engage the asset will usually be sent. In this case, we would engage the service through its coordinated schedule at the DER facility. While the service is being performed, it's typically measured and performance is verified. At the end, there's settlement. This is the most important part of the service because people provide services in order to get paid. So compensation will be made in whatever way is specified in the grid service agreement. Criterion 8, Resource Discovery Methods for Assisting with Identification and Integration Between Actors, is a criterion under the Configuration and Evolution category. We apply it directly to the ESI, which tweaks the language a little bit, to talk about resource discovery methods to support the integration of interacting actors. We go through a review process example, review the resource discovery and announcement capabilities of the standard. So this is something that you would do to a standard, say like IEEE 2030.5. We gave some example questions to assist with the assessment, and then we make a few notes that are either assumptions or things that may be out of scope for the energy service interface. If we were assessing a specific standard, we might note where the topic is discussed within the standard, and then we give some examples of the fields that would be necessary for the ESI. During this entire review process, we're also looking to make sure that the standard is compliant with those ESI principles that we discussed earlier. While the process is a little bit arduous, it's very worthwhile to develop an interoperable standard and to meet the energy service interface policies such as privacy and device agnosticity. Here I show you a few of the reasons why you might be interested in developing an energy service interface. For standards organizations, it broadens the applicability of the standard to service-oriented use cases. And it aids in developing profiles that help users more easily implement the standard to support grid DER service interactions. For individual users of the standard, it makes it easier to implement service-oriented applications and improves the interoperability of those applications. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Please feel free to reach out at jamie.colon@pnnl.gov if you have any questions at all about energy service interfaces or our common grid service definitions. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation today, and a big thank you to all of our panel members. For more information about GWAC and our activities, please visit gridwiseac.org, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at the link provided.